Hello, and welcome to the Classical Guitar Heroines podcast.
Join us as we celebrate the remarkable contributions of women in this timeless art form, featuring insightful interviews, captivating stories, and performances that showcase their talent and dedication.
I'm your host, Bridget Gerard, classical guitarist and member of the Kitchener-Waterloo Guitar Orchestra.
And I'm your host, Mariette Stevenson, founder, music director, and conductor of the Kitchener-Waterloo Guitar Orchestra and professor of guitar at Wilfrid Laurier University and the University of Waterloo.
We are excited to bring you the lives and music of these classical guitar heroines, past and present, to share with you their enduring impact on music and our world.
On this episode, we will discuss with Dr. Candice Mowbray the career of the wonderful Spanish guitarist Josephina Robledo. Appearing as a soloist, collaborative musician, and guest lecturer, guitarist Candice Mowbray has been featured artist for festivals and concert series throughout North America. She is a recipient of the Maryland State Art Council's 2020 Independent Artist Award and has performed with ensembles such as the Washington National Opera at the Kennedy Center, Maryland Symphony Orchestra, Wolf Trap Opera, Satori, and Pro Arte Chamber Orchestra of Greater Washington. Her CD, Reverie, has been featured on radio shows such as In Tune on BBC Radio 3 and G-Strings with Tom Cole in Washington, D.C. Candice Mowbray earned the Doctorate of Musical Arts in Classical Guitar Performance from Shenandoah Conservatory in Virginia. She has held teaching positions with Shepherd University in West Virginia, Shenandoah Conservatory, Hagerstown, and Frederick Community Colleges, as well as numerous schools of music in the Mid-Atlantic region. She also works with the nonprofit organization Marlowe Guitar International. She is a highly regarded guest lecturer and author of numerous articles on women and classical guitar, and notably played a key role in providing research and liner notes for Berta Rojas' 2022 recording, Legado, which won 2 Latin Grammy Awards.
Welcome to the Classical Guitar Heroines podcast. Candice, it is such a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be here.
Your lectures and writing have focused on Ida Presti, Maria Luisa Anido, and Louise Walker, as well as Francesca Caccini, Amelia Giuliani, Madame Sidney Pratton, and Valda Alcott Bickford. Which women are you currently researching?
So it's really interesting to me. I was thinking back as you say that list of people that I gave my first lecture on women in guitar history back in 2006. And back then I talked about women in classical guitar, jazz, rock, blues, all kinds of styles. And so the scope was very wide that at that time, I know it sounds very dated, but this was pre-social media and internet as we know it. And so I often felt like I was on a scavenger hunt for names, like any name I could find that sounded like it might be somebody identifying as a woman, I would just collect the material. Then when I went on to pursue my doctorate, I narrowed the focus down to where I really wanted to study Ida Presti, Maria Luisa Anido, and Louise Walker. And I had heard them referred to as the 3 grand dames of the 20th century guitar. So then as that pursued, and I actually had to write my thesis, it got narrowed down even further to just Ida Presti. So then fast forward post-school, and I start doing these lectures. Personally, I wanted to have more of an historical retrospective. So it grew again into the list that you just provided. And then, I really wanted, with those lectures, to get people excited about the players and help facilitate interested people into being able to find their own information about those players, and then also celebrate the work of other people who are researching. So all of that to say that has been my work for a really long time. And for me, a lot of it culminated with the project working with and for Berta Rojas, which was just incredible. And for years, people had said, well, maybe you should write a book, And I didn't really want to take that on. So working on the project for Berta kind of felt like a great capstone. I wrote those really lengthy liner notes and like talk about unexpected places you end up. I mean, what an amazing thing to get to go to the Latin Grammy Awards and watch her win. And, to play any part in that, it was just unbelievable. So I kind of felt like my really in-depth research was in a sense sort of over. It's not to say I wasn't going to keep learning and studying because that's just who I am, but really digging in. I just planned to be more casual about it. But then, the summer came around and you contacted me. And rather than talk about somebody I already knew, I thought, oh, this is an opportunity to learn something new. So who's on my radar right now? Well, I always want to learn more about Louise Walker, even though I've studied her a lot. And I wish I could do even more to share her music with the world. Other people, Renata Tarago, I'm very interested in just personally, musically. My friends have really encouraged me to study Monina Tavora and also Maria Rita Brondi, especially since she wrote guitar history text. But who I chose for today and who is at the front of my attention right now is Josephina Robledo, who was one of the famous students of Tárrega.
Well, before we get to Robledo, when discussing Francisco Tárrega and his student Miguel Lobet, there are multiple women whose names arise in that lineage. Can you speak to that?
Oh, yes. So with Llobet, some of the biggest names that come up, Maria Luisa Anido, as well as Louise Walker. So Anido was an Argentinian guitarist, lived 1907 to 1996, had an absolutely incredible career as a concert artist and a teacher. Her father was a great supporter of the guitar, founded a guitar magazine, hosted guitarists in the family home. And Anido studied with Domingo Prat, but for a few months, she studied with Josephina Robledo when Pratt was away. It was actually under Robledo's instruction when she gave her first recital in 1916. But then later, Nido becomes the student of Llobet, with whom she also performed and made duet recordings between 1925 and 29. He actually said that Maria Luisa Nido was a revelation for him.
And I think that the Do Re Mi label has some of those recordings, those
Oh,
duet
yes.
recordings. So we'll get a little bit into the Do Re Mi label. But first off, who was Josephina Robledo and where was she born?
So she was from Argentina. There's a really nice story about her father was taking guitar lessons, I think with Domingo Prat, and she would kind of sneak and listen in. And one day when her dad left the room, she took the guitar and was playing around with it. And when her dad came in, she was afraid he'd be upset, but he wasn't. Instead, he went out and bought her a guitar. And so she really proved to be a prodigy. And he helped her career until he died, which was fairly young in her life. And that stopped her touring activities for a while. It was hard for her to, as a female at that time, to travel alone. And she, kind of stayed local to her mother for the most part, but she was active. She taught, she recorded, she played on radio. And then when her mom died in the early 50s, she really started touring. And it just took off. It's like she toured relentlessly for the rest of her life and all over the world, the biggest halls from Paris to Moscow to, just all over the place. And she herself was very influential, taught a lot of students, did a lot of arranging, really one of the great, great guitarists of the 20th century.
And so like Ida Presti, she was indeed a child prodigy.
Oh, yeah. She gave her first recital when she was very, very young I think at La Argentina Hall in Buenos Aires. So, yeah.
Wow.
And then Louise Walker was also a student of Llobet. Also, her father was very involved in guitar, and he organized the Vienna Guitar Club and helped bring, lots of guitar players to the city. And there's this really nice story that I always remember in Walker's autobiography, where she was studying with Llobet, who had, come to stay with them, and that he would sometimes motivate her to work on Tárrega's Etude La Mariposa, by saying how wonderfully his other student, Maria Luisa Nito, could play it. So he kind of taught her into practicing that. But yeah, those are the two of the super famous women who studied with Jobet. Also Reseda Rhodes, who I haven't studied as much, but she was one of his students. And then I also mentioned Graciano Tarago, the father of Renata, who I mentioned earlier that I'm really interested in. He studied with Jobet. And then with Tárrega as well, there are lots of women's names who arise. Marita Rita Brondi, who I mentioned. And like you were talking about the Do Re Mi label in the series, Andre Segovia and his contemporaries. You know, that series is so amazing for the music as well as the liner notes. Volume 12 features Robledo, but the liner notes really go into talking about the various students of both Jobet and Tárrega. And it's just an absolutely wonderful resource. So for Tárrega, it also lists Pepita Roca. And there's a name I didn't know. And so I apologize to other folks who may already be a fan of this person, but I'm assuming this person would be a woman, Elvira Mingo Boss. And I haven't found any information on that person yet, but I'm excited to do so. And then, of course, Josephina Robledo was Tárrega's student. And those same liner notes, it's really nice. It quotes that he called her his little disciple.
Who was Josephina Robledo and where was she born?
Josephina Robledo was born in Valencia, Spain in 1892 and died in 1972. In case I didn't mention before, you know, I just started this research this summer and I'm really in the thick of it. And one of the interesting things about being in that phase is that one day you read something and you take your notes on it, and then a few weeks later, whatever you just learned was refuted. And so one of the points that comes up that has some mixed answers in sources is actually what her real birth date was. Sometimes you'll see 1892, and then other times you'll see 1897. And so that can skew some of those facts that people find interesting, like how old was she when she gave her first recital, or, you know, was she a child prodigy, and those kinds of things, with that being a pretty significant difference, you know, there in dates. I'm not, you know, at the point in the studies where I'm finding birth records or anything like that. But based on all the resources I've viewed, I really think that it's most likely that 1892 was her birth date. So as mentioned, she was a student of Tárrega. She taught Maria Luisa Nito briefly when she was in Argentina. She had great success as a performer, published some transcriptions and taught. She was very influential in popularizing classical guitar in Brazil during the first half of the 20th century and helping to spread the techniques and styles associated with Tárrega to South Americans, especially Brazil.
Candice, for those people who may not know about Francisco Tárrega, who was he and why was he important to the history of guitar?
He was a Spanish guitarist, lived from 1852 to 1909. He's often referred to as the father of the modern guitar or the father of the modern guitar school. That doesn't literally mean that he led a formal school or even published a guitar method, but rather that he was really influential. He brought together several technical elements, not to say that he was the first to ever use them, but he brought them together and then taught and performed using these elements. So he advocated the use of a footstool, which was especially conducive to using the Torres guitars that he played on, which were larger than 19th century guitars had been in the past. He encouraged use of the brush stroke, which could be very, very expressive. Also really expressive is he would place melodies where they would move up one of the wound strings rather than keeping the range where, let's say if the melody has an octave range, rather than doing that all in first position, he might, exploit the tonal qualities of the fifth or fourth string. And you can use a lot of vibrato and it creates almost a cello-like effect. Related to that also, he would voice chords higher on the neck, but incorporate open strings. And so some really interesting techniques like that. But then also combined with that was his incredible skill at transcription and composition. So he had studied harmony. He also was a pianist. he would transcribe music by really famous non-guitar composers, so Beethoven and Schumann and Chopin and Bach. And that becomes very important. You see that trend of playing transcriptions by those kind of composers. You see that in the programs of many people throughout the first half of the 20th century. Certainly you see it in Maria Luisa Anido and Josephina Robledo. And when we think about with Robledo, elevating the classical guitar into acceptance as a classical instrument, you can think about the role of an audience hearing something like the Adagio sostenuto of Moonlight Sonata in a concert hall. But then he also is a wonderful composer. And what's so unique about him, is so special, is that he has written pieces that a person in their earlier years of study, that is accessible to them for performance, but some of those same pieces are so musically interesting and beautiful that you'll still hear them in the hands of a concert player. So, works like, works like Lagrima or, Capriccio Arabe, even though it's not a beginner's piece, but you do hear a lot of students play it, but you could also hear a concert artist play it.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then I do want to mention, I was doing a project on him a couple of years ago, and I asked some colleagues, like, what was the piece that got you interested in classical guitar? And many of them said Recuerdos de la Alhambra.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have students that will say the same thing.
Now, Robledo was a student of Tárrega and performed at events honoring him during her lifetime. Is there anything you can share about their student-teacher experience?
She was a part of two events, one in 1952 and one in 1959, where former students, or they're called disciples of Tárrega, got together and were part of these events honoring him. The first honoring the 100-year anniversary of his birth, and the latter honoring 50 years after his death. But one of the things that's really interesting is that she gave a speech at the later event, and that speech is available. I believe an audio recording of it is available. I accessed it through a website called Ultra Chord, and there was a transcription of her speech where she was asked to speak about Tárrega. And now I had to use Google Translate to get kind of a rough translation of it. But if I understood the text correctly, there's just some really intimate and wonderful things that she shares about her time with Tárrega. She talks about her first experience hearing Tárrega in concert. She describes what he looked like when he took the stage and his demeanor, and how she and her father lost like all track of time when they were listening to him because they were so enveloped by the music. Her father had arranged for her to play for Tárrega. And so after Tárrega's concert, he called her up in front of the audience to get up and play. And she describes that experience, and Tárrega announcing that he would become her teacher. Yeah, it seems that also when he left Valencia and was back in Barcelona, she missed her lessons so much that she traveled to Barcelona to study with him and was received in his home and felt considered like one of the family members. And then Tárrega, when he came back to Valencia, he suffered from health problems, and he was ill and had asked Josephina Robledo's father for advice about a place to stay, and her father invited him into their home. They set up a special place for him. And if my translation is correct, she commissioned herself to basically be his nurse.
Wow.
And she goes into detail about caring for his eyes. And I won't give the details here, but the specific things she had to do each day to help him with his eyes. It's quite intimate. And I really recommend anyone who's interested in looking that up, either listening or reading the transcription of it. It's a lot of insight, into this relationship. She also says, he was an incredibly kind person, even on days when she knew maybe he felt bad and didn't want to do this or that. He was always really gracious to people. And at other points in time, she mentions that there were letters exchanged between Tárrega and the Robledo family. She's donated them to a museum in Villarreal. One of those letters, my rough translation, the closing says, a sincere greeting from your teacher who loves you so much.
Oh,
that's so sweet.
Yeah.
that's incredible.
Yeah.
Would you describe Robledo as a child prodigy?
So with Josephina Robledo, she is referenced as a child prodigy in Randy Osborne and Hector Garcia Martinez's books, Annotations for the History of the Classical Guitar in Argentina. There's also a mention in the book Light in the Darkness, which is about Joaquin Rodrigo. She's mentioned as a Wunderkind.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking objectively, I personally don't have, at least as of yet, any specific program information for what she would have played in her, first recital. But she did start guitar as a child. That's mentioned in the speech that we were talking about. Some sources say she started studying with Tárrega at age 7, while at least one other says she met Tárrega in 1904. So if you start to do some of that math, if she was born in 1892, that would mean she was 12 when she met Tárrega.
Mm-hmm.
There's another source that says she was a developed concert artist by age 12. Yeah, so it's a little difficult, the details in there. But we do know that she gave her first concert in 1907 at the Conservatory of Valencia, and Tárrega was in the audience. So if she was born in 1892, that would make her about 14 or 15 years old at the time for her debut. We also know that she came to Argentina in 1914, so she'd have been about 22, and she was teaching Anido in 1916. So, I mean, she would have been a pretty developed artist by her early 20s.
Wow.
That's amazing. With that, we will listen to a recording of Josephina Robledo performing Capriccio Arrivé, composed by Francisco Tárrega from the Andre Segovia and His Contemporaries Volume 12 CD on the Do Re Mi label. The recordings that we will feature were home recordings by her husband, with Robledo performing at the age of 67 just before she retired from the concert stage. Many thanks to Jack Silver, Jacob Harnoy, and the Do Re Mi label for allowing us to play these recordings you will hear on this episode.
That was Josephina Robledo performing Capriccio Arabe by Francisco Tárrega from Andre Segovia and His Contemporaries, Volume 12 on the Do Re Mi label. You are listening to the Classical Guitar Heroines podcast. Josephina Robledo went to South America in 1912. Why did she go there and what did she do?
With the reading that I've done, again, dates, some sources will say 1912, but a number of the resources I've encountered say that she actually visited Argentina in 1914. And that at least one source says that she did that as part of a zarzuela company. She went there to perform with this ensemble group, but it was advised that it would be beneficial for her to start giving solo concerts. So she visited Argentina, but then she goes back to Europe and returned the very next year. So in 1915, she returned. She toured Uruguay, Paraguay, and Brazil before eventually settling in Brazil, first in Sao Paulo and then Rio de Janeiro. And she stayed there until 1923. One of her first big concerts in Sao Paulo, I think, was in 1917, to kind of give some perspective of dates there. By, I guess, September 1923, we find her back in Argentina, being awarded a full professor position at a conservatory. But then she actually leaves Argentina in 1924 and goes back to Europe, where she stays for the rest of her life. For a really detailed account of her time in Brazil, I really want to recommend a paper by Leandro Marcio Gonçalves. Again, the paper is in Portuguese, so I'm going to give kind of a rough translation of the title, but it would be The Process of Diffusion of the Classical Guitar in Brazil through the Tárrega School between 1916 and 1960. And it was a master's thesis written for Evora University. This paper is incredible. Like I said, it's a really detailed account of her time in Brazil, her influence while she's there, but then even after she's gone. There are lots and lots of citations and quotes from newspaper and magazine articles and concert reviews that really show this incredible impact that she made in her time in Brazil. She taught while she was there. One of them actually went on to publish the first classical guitar book in Brazil, Carlos Barbosa Lima mentions that in an article that was printed in Soundboard, a highly influential figure in South America.
Robledo permanently returned to Europe in 1924 at the age of 32, which is 12 years after she first left Europe. Do we know why she returned?
So I was really curious about this because it seems like a relatively short time in her lifespan, to be in South America. And I was really excited when I finally found what might be the answer. And it was in the paper by Gonçalves, again, translating Portuguese, but it looks as though she returned. Remember, she was in Argentina and got this full professorship. And soon after that, she heads back to Europe. But it looks like it was because her father was ill.
Mm.
Yeah. He goes on to mention that after about 10 years, she gives a European tour, performances in Madrid, Paris, and Brussels. And this is really enlightening. He mentions that there were plans for concerts in Cuba and the United States.
Mm.
Wow.
But then her mother and sister died,
Mm.
and it, interrupted that. Again, what a great paper. Really lots of great information there.
We will listen next to a recording of Josephina Robledo performing Prelude No. 1 and Prelude No. 2, composed by Francisco Tárrega from André Segovia and His Contemporaries, Volume 12, on the Do Re Mi label.
That was Josephina Robledo performing Prelude No. 1 and Prelude No. 2 by Francisco Tárrega from André Segovia and His Contemporaries, Volume 12 on the Do Re Mi label. You are listening to the Classical Guitar Heroines podcast. Can you talk a little bit about the recordings that we're featuring in this episode, Candice?
Yeah, it's wonderful to have these recordings and all of the historic recordings from Do Re Mi. I mean, what a great series. When listening to Capriccio Rabe, we hear her interpretation of, the virtuosic passages, the passages that people take freedoms with rhythmically and with accelerandi and that kind of thing. So it's great to hear her interpretation, having been somebody who studied with Tárrega. What stands out to me in that particular recording is actually something far more subtle. And it's something that I'm drawn to that defines a lot of my favorite players, which is just some of the internal phrasing, a little descending bass line that maybe only comprises a measure, but it's really thoughtfully played and understood. And so speaking to that idea with the preludes that are on that recording, 1, 2, and then also 5, I listened to them and I sat back, and the overarching word that came to mind for me was patience, which is a little hard to verbalize what I mean by that. I don't mean like that they were slow or anything like that, but just there was no sense of urgency to get to the end of the piece. Like you just live in this, I don't want to say timeless space because there's tempo and meter and it's totally there, but she'll just take time, in resolutions and cadences. It's like she's really communicating something to you and there's no rush to be somewhere else. It's all very, very elegant. Prelude 1. So there's these accents that are in measures like 13, 14, and 15. There's actually accents written in one of the publications. And they're not forced. They're just stresses, and they're very elegant and gracious. Her slurred figures in that piece, they're psi figures. They aren't these just kind of technical things like, oh, there's slurs marked, I better play them. They're psi figures. They're lyrical. I just feel like listening to her is listening to somebody with a really deep musical understanding who has the ability to then communicate that understanding with the listener. Her tone, she didn't use nails. She was one of the Tárrega students that didn't use nails, and it is robust and beautiful. There's also some practical things I noticed listening to the recording. So prelude number 2, there's a second section with a first and second ending. Some recordings, not hers, but just some recordings, people, after they play the first ending, they go all the way back to the beginning of the piece, play it all through again, and then play the second ending. And in her recording, she doesn't do that. She goes back to the beginning of the section where there is actually a double bar, but there isn't a matching repeat sign, at least in the publication I have, which is, an early Spanish publication. I also found it really interesting. I had to listen a few times to Prelude 5, that the G sharp that begins the primary, motive of that piece, she actually plays it an octave higher than what's written in the publication that I have. And I wasn't sure because I was listening on kind of just earbuds and I was like, pressing them into my ears. With it being a historic recording and there being noise, home recording, really, I thought maybe I was just hearing overtones. But then I listened to it at home on, my office speakers, and I'm pretty sure that that's what's happening. So, there's things like that. And what a wonderful resource for those of us who want to play Tárrega's music, to be able to have those recordings. It's a window into the past.
Yeah, absolutely. She published some of those arrangements. Could you talk about those?
I've collected her scores for Venetian Gondola Song by Mendelssohn, the famous Funeral March by Chopin, the Adagio Sostenuto by Beethoven from his Moonlight Sonata, Danza No. 7 by Granados. In the advertisements that are printed with those scores, there's a pretty consistent list of what her available transcriptions were. So in addition to those pieces I just mentioned, they also advertise a Chopin waltz, a waltz by Godard, a piece by Schumann, a romanza by Rubinstein, Torre Bermeja, Cadiz and Cordoba by Albanese, and then a couple of pieces by Manuel de Falla. I haven't seen advertisements that list transcriptions other than that catalog. But concert programs that are printed in Randy Osborne, Hector Garcia Martinez's books, they indicate lots more. these concert programs, it indicates that she was performing her own arrangements of a Siciliana by Bach, a Romance by Tchaikovsky, as well as works by Daquin, Aguirre, Salvador, Grieg, Cui, and other people. It must have been, a part of her practice, just like her teacher. I haven't yet actually been able to sit down and analyze the arrangements and, compare and contrast her style of arranging to Tárrega or her fellow disciples of Tárrega.
Speaking to that, can you discuss the importance of studying and recognizing Robledo's work?
So my own reasons aside for, why I chose to learn about this great guitarist in history is, there's just many aspects to her and her contributions that I think other people will find interesting. One aspect is to think about being able to hear one of Tárrega's beloved students, one with whom he lived, one who was devoted enough to him to take care of him and nurse him. And so like I said, it's a window into that world. She was also one of the disciples to pay homage to him at those special events in Spain. So that in itself kind of puts her at the forefront of the conversation about Tárrega. She's credited with being one of the persons most influential in elevating the status of the guitar as a classical instrument in Brazil. Multiple resources cite that she and Agustin Barrios were especially fundamental to that, the guitar being recognized in high society. Especially with Robledo, she lived and taught there in Brazil for many years. So that also is really important. And there's numerous newspapers and concert reviews that testify to that. Some of these great papers, they don't just study Robledo, they're studying, the guitar in Brazil and what was it like before her and before Barrios, and sharing examples of newspaper articles and commentary where the guitar is just kind of frowned upon. There are numerous newspapers and concert reviews cited in some great papers that testify to how wonderful her performances were and the role that she played in elevating the view of guitar. So I actually have a quote that I'd like to share from a paper called Image and Representation in Women Guitar Players, Some Reflections on Josephina Robledo. This is by Patricia Pereira Porto and Isabel Porto Nogueira. So they cite a quotation that was from newspaper in 1918. And the quote is, "Fairy hands, yes, that only fairy hands can be the hands that hold the fragility of that magnificent guitar and go to the depths of its soul and extract from it a sound made of moonlight and make that sound mirror itself through the environment, perfuming it with a very soft poetry and penetrating the heart of those who listen, elevating it in a very sweet caress. We can see that the artist who achieves so much is a perfect artist, and Josephina Robledo is so, due to her dizzying technique, which allows her to absolutely master this instrument, which is one of the most difficult in existence." Again, that's my translation, but I think it gets to the heart of it. I mean, really these beautiful, incredible, and it's not like there's one or two. I mean, there's a multitude of these quotes about her. We know she was a wonderful and influential performer. And of course, as a teacher, I mentioned the first classical guitar book being published with, came from one of her students. And it was her work with Anito that, first got me introduced to her name. Another thing to study about Robledo are the interesting concert programs. Yeah, so like I mentioned that several are shared in Osborne and Martinez's book. And it's really neat that she performed a number of concerts in South America that occurred in 3 parts. So in the first part, she'd play solo. And those works included her own arrangements, that we talked about, and then also arrangements by Tárrega. Then there would be a second part to the program that she would play in duet with a cellist. Yeah, and then the third part of the program, she'd come back and play solo again. So that concert format, is really interesting. The fact that she's playing Tárrega's arrangements and her own arrangements, I think is really neat and worth studying. Segue into another point, that cellist, Fernando Molina, there's a review that mentions that she was performing in duet with her husband. And so I don't think he was her husband. She actually got married in 1927. We know that man's name. It wasn't Molina. Like you think, okay, well, was it just a silly mistake? Like there's a man and a woman, and they're having this, musical partnership is intimate, and that can really be misconstrued, But it got me thinking about Maria Luisa Neto and her career and her travels, that when her father died, she didn't go out on tour. And, there's comments about how it was hard for a woman to do that on her own, to travel solo without being unaccompanied. So that would be a neat point of study about Robledo, is she went from Spain to South America, part of a group at first, and then, working in this duo. Is it possible that, this reference to him as her husband was truly an accident? Maybe they were boyfriend and girlfriend and, they just implied husbandry, or maybe it was a purposeful thing to travel with a man as a duo partner so that you could do that and feel safe. And yeah, so I'm not trying to insinuate or project. I'm just presenting the questions. So that's a whole other aspect of why it would be an interesting area to study about her. There's an international competition that's taken place for several years that's in her honor, and a statuette of her was one of the prizes given out in that. So, if you're just looking for kind of other great reasons to celebrate her, and I want to mention one last aspect with that.
Sure.
So people dedicated music to her. There are quattro piezas by João Octaviano Gonçalves bears her dedication. Eduardo Lopez Chavarri dedicated his Sonata No. 2 to her. And here was something new that I learned just this last week. I'm so excited to share this.
Awesome. Let's hear it.
So in the book, A Light in the Darkness, The Music and Life of Joaquin Rodrigo, it states that he originally dedicated his, I'm going to pronounce this wrong, I apologize, Preludio al Atardecer. It translates as Prelude to the Sunset. He originally dedicated that work to her. It's his first work he wrote for guitar.
Oh, wow.
Now, he did scratch out the dedication later. Okay, I don't have the story on why that happened. But I mean, that's profound. This wonderful, celebrated one of the biggest names in composition for classical guitar. His first guitar piece was actually dedicated to her. And the book, discusses that her return to Valencia, being there in 1925, was an important element, along with several others, but was possibly an element in his decision to write for guitar.
Wow.
So that concept, that's always been a part of my work, we can't all go out and give lectures, we can't all appear on podcasts, but lots of guitar players can play concerts, and lots of guitar players can teach music. So recognizing, Rodrigo dedicated a work to Louise Walker. And didn't Tárrega write a work for Madame Sidney Pratton? And of course, like Poulenc, Sarabande, that so many people play, dedicated to Ida Presti. So that's just another way that we can actually bring these women's names into the everyday conversation and really share their stories and legacies. So yeah, so I hope that answers why we should study Josephina Robledo, or at least why I've decided to study her.
And if any of our listeners are interested in additional resources for information, can you share any that you would recommend?
I have posted essays about women in guitar history. I have this blog entry where I do it on my website. I have a very short essay about Robledo that I wrote ages ago. I'm not sure when I'll be able to actually update the essay itself, but I do plan to update the list of resources.
Oh, good.
So the things that I keep referencing, there's all these great papers. Well, I'll put the names of them right there and in the original Portuguese so that people can actually, search and then seek them out. Again, I have to call out Jack Silver and the Do Re Mi label.
The incredible Jack Silver.
Oh my goodness. In those pre-internet social media days, his and John Dwart's writings were like kind of my core resources for people, because that's how little information, we had back in those days. And thank goodness for those wonderful people. So volume 12 features Robledo. And then it was actually Jack Silver when I was in Toronto, and where you and I, Mariette, got to actually meet in person.
Yes.
It was Jack who carried those big 4-volume sets of works by Randy Osborne and Hector Garcia Martinez, Annotations for the History of the Classical Guitar in Argentina, 1822 to 2000. He actually carried those to the luncheon, so I'd get to see them. And I'm so thankful to him for doing that.
Oh.
These books are nothing short of incredible. I mean, first of all, just on the topic of women in guitar, volume 2, which is hefty, is solely dedicated to women. But women are featured alongside men throughout all the volumes. The cover features a drawing of Anita and Yobette playing as a duet. The entries on all the guitarists, I mean, there's biographies, translations of biographies, programs, photos of programs, photos of their albums, mementos, letters, articles. It is just incredible. Like, there's no other word for it. There's also these beautiful pictures of schools that developed in Argentina in the early part of the century with huge numbers of female students. You know, on my website, on that blog, I have this list that says to be added, and it's a list of women's names. And it's kind of a tongue-in-cheek thing for myself because I know I'll never get to like writing essays on all of them. And I thought about, as I was going through these volumes of books, like gradually adding all the names that are in these books. And I can't. Just go get the books. Like, it's incredible. So aside from those resources, some of the interesting papers, I mentioned the master thesis by Leandro Marcia Gonçalves from 2015, a paper by Flavia Prado called Spanish Guitarist in 19th Century Sao Paulo. That's the paper that actually goes into like the pre-Robledo getting there and like actually talking about these other great folks who really were laying a foundation and doing important work. The footnotes and the bibliography for that are part of what got me to some of the other resources. Flight of the Maiden, Representations of Women and the Guitar in Brazilian Culture by Claudia Araujo Garcia. I believe both those papers were translated by Diego Alvarez. Image and Representation in Women Guitar Players, Reflections on Josephina Robledo that I quoted from a little bit ago. There's a brief biography published by Royal Classics in 2005. The Ultra Court website that I mentioned earlier that had transcription of Robledo's talk from 1959. She's mentioned in biographies of Francisco Tárrega as well as Joaquin Rodrigo, of course. So like I said, there's several more, and I'm saying it out loud that I will at some point update my website so that they're there for the next person doing their work. Maybe it'll help give them a leg up, which is something I hope to do.
Our last recording of Josephina Robledo will be Prelude number 5, composed by Francisco Tárrega from the CD Andre Segovia and His Contemporaries, Volume 12, on the Do Re Mi label.
That was Josephina Robledo performing Prelude No. 5 by Francisco Tárrega from André Segovia and his contemporaries, Volume 12 on the Do Re Mi label. You are listening to the Classical Guitar Heroines podcast. We would like to thank Dr. Candice Mowbray for sharing her time and research with us. Candice, do you have any last thoughts you want to share with our listeners?
I just want to thank you for, having me, but creating this opportunity for me to learn something new. And, it's really enjoyable. I kind of forget until I'm doing it how much I enjoy learning and digging and really, promoting the work of other people who have already done great, written these great papers and articles. So thanks for just providing that opportunity. It's really been wonderful. And it was great to sit and listen to these recordings.
And it was fantastic to have you on the podcast. Thank you. We would like to thank Dr. Candice Mowbray, Jack Silver, Jacob Harnoy, and the Do Re Mi label for their generous support and contributions to this episode. If you would like to find out more information about Do Re Mi's guitar recordings, please visit their website. Please visit Dr. Candice Mowbray's website for more information on her valuable research and recordings. You can follow Classical Guitar Heroines podcast on Facebook and Instagram. And remember, if you are a woman that plays classical guitar, you too are a classical guitar heroine. Thank you for joining us on the Classical Guitar Heroine podcast.